Hello and welcome to Short Stories Written and Read by Ballerscheff. If you'd like to read along as I read these stories, you can find a link in the description of this video to my blog. As always, remember to like, share, and subscribe. You're listening to A Neutral Expression. Others, faced with their predicaments and futures, might look out the window wistfully. He tried this, and should it fail, he took a walk around the city and thought about calling a friend for advice. Often he ended up where he was now, at the harbor. There he watched the boats, anchored or sailing, or watched the water that the boats didn't disturb. The anchored boats, a few of them yachts, the others smaller and more modest, bobbed slowly in the water. If he got too excited and started talking, to himself or into his phone, too loudly for those around him to ignore, it helped to look at the boats and calm himself that way. In fall, the leaves fell and floated in the water around the boats. In winter, the water was still too warm to freeze. At most there were flakes that drifted in the water as the leaves did in the fall. The boating season came in spring and announced itself by the empty spaces in the harbor. In the distance he would see the boats that used to be there, their figures vanishingly small against the sea that stretched out behind them. He had to squint to see them and would crane his neck out, too, to bring them that little bit closer. Up and down the harbor he now went, talking to himself as if there were no one else there to be bothered by it. His loudness came naturally to him. He did not feel as if he were raising his voice, but rather he lowered it on other occasions to an appropriate level. With what he now knew, he had hoped to solve his problem alone. Walking along the harbor at a pace no slower for that he was deep in thought, he saw that he would need help. What was bothering him was that he was thinking of changing jobs. He had once been an administrative assistant and was now a manager. He had received an offer from a business in the city in which he lived. A second offer came from a place further away, but which would pay more. Both businesses were in retail and of roughly the same size, so pay and distance were his main considerations. He was talking to himself again, and not even thinking, only worrying. Which offer should he take? What if something better came along, and what if it didn't? The more he worried, the less he did, and the more he lost sight of the problem at hand. His friends could help with that, could take him through his worries and ask him which were and weren't sensible. Should a conversation turn to that, his friends wanted to be direct about it and held his attention to one thing at a time. Whoever he talked to about his problems, they all spoke to him in the same way. They knew he tended to go from one problem to another, thinking of each as a part of a larger whole. If he began to drift like this, they would work against this tendency as best they could and made sure he finished whatever point he started. Wait, hold on, stick to the point, they would say, very direct in their instructions. They spoke with a certain force as they said this, and from talking to them in person, he knew they moved their free hands as they spoke, as if to bat his words away. Irritated at being cut off, he hoped he would later see, when he had found a solution to his problem, that there was no need to discuss each of his concerns individually. In the end, they would all fall away for him to forget about. His friends sometimes couldn't tell what was his main problem and what were his worries. They tried to take it one thing at a time, but knew why that was hard for him. The most powerful of these worries were those he could do nothing about. In this case, he worried about which offer to take, and less understandably to his friends, about how it would work out. It was a vague question. Both of them could see that, and both of them knew what he meant by it. That was what his worrying came to. It frustrated him, he said, because there was nothing he could do. It was best not to think about it, he added, in a tone of voice that sounded as if he wanted to take back what he said. His friends could understand why, to him, it was part of a larger whole, which he could divide up into as many questions as they wanted him to divide it. He could see why they wanted to take each question in its turn, and he did it that way for them. Even after he'd explained it to them, however, his friends couldn't understand why it should bother him as much as it did. They had tried and failed to tease this out of him, and as he continued along the harbor, he tried to stop thinking about it. If it was the season for it, he might happen to meet a boater, perhaps untying their boat. He on the harbor and the man on his boat, they would talk across the water between them about how long the man had had the boat and how he'd gotten started. Whatever impression he might make on the man with his face drawn tight in thought and a mouth made thin and tight by the same, he quickly relaxed as they talked. Should he see someone and feel like talking, and find that same mood reflected in the other person's face, he would stop and approach them. The more he frowned, the happier he was to have a diversion from his thoughts, and the faster his mood changed. The people he talked to, he saw, were a little amazed at the sudden and total transformation. But there was nobody here now, though there were boats on the water. He found that most of them had gotten started when they were young, because of their fathers, or at around the age they were now. Between that, there was no time for it. The boaters' faces, he noticed, were either still young or dry and cracked. Less so around the eyes, it seemed, if they wore a cap to protect themselves. It was hard to tell their age because they didn't seem to age by degrees. He often wore a neutral expression, though it looked like a slight frown. It made people think he was in a worse mood than he was. That was how his face was set. It had nothing to do with what he felt. When he had reason to frown, it only enhanced the expression he usually wore. When he had had something on his mind for a while, it would begin to show itself by a tension in the body and a tendency to sigh. These were the signs that preceded a call to a friend for help. At such times there were only two sorts of conversations he could have about what was bothering him and everything else. He had decided, in the case of the second offer, to ask for a higher range of salary. It was, as he saw it, two chances at the same job, so he may as well push his luck with one and be reasonable with the other, to keep it as a safe bet. He encouraged himself with the thought that he had attained a position of some importance. He was far enough in his career to say that, but not so far that he had become over-specialized and was tied to a certain industry forever. He didn't think that could happen to someone like him, whose job wasn't specific to any industry. That, besides the task of administration and his skill for it, was something he liked about his job, the safety of his position and the guarantee of his usefulness. He had at one point managed to narrow it down to these two offers. As more had come in, he grew less certain whether either of the two were what he really wanted, and if it wasn't one of the others in another industry that would do it for him. He had thought about it and discussed it with friends, and a problem talked about for too long, with no solution in sight, frayed his nerves. Whether he looked out from one side of his house or another, onto the back lot and the other houses with which his stood clustered together, or onto the street, neither were very conducive to thought, so he had come to the harbor. It was a small city, and there was a good chance someone would recognize him on the street, not as a friend, but as a stranger that they had seen before and would see again without learning his name. Where his walks ended depended in part on where he was when their call began and how long it or his conversations with himself lasted, though he looked ahead for the harbor regardless. There were pigeons in the city square, there were seabirds by the harbor. The seabirds' cries were loud and piercing, the pigeons low and quiet, less of a blast than a coo from the back of the throat or from some place deeper still. He had to be close to hear it. The pigeons would scatter should he come too close. They took flight if he pursued them further, but only for a short distance. It was an exaggerated leap, the flap of their wings louder than any cooing they made. His friends would hear it too, over the phone, and had with time come to distinguish between the birds and their sounds. Hearing seabirds, they would ask if he was at the harbor, and he would say they had quite the ear for birds. Else they would notice the noises in the background and simply conclude he was out of the house. He had told his friend about changing jobs and the rest of it about a week ago, and had gotten the reply he'd expected, that his problems were nothing, his friend would like to have them. He had to laugh and agree. A little smile spread across his face and surprised him. The joke helped to clear his head a little and to relieve his friend's envy at his fortunate position. "If you have to have him," he said. "If you have to have them," he said. "Well, I'll think about it and see what I can do." With that, they left it there and went on to other things, while he continued to work at it in the back of his mind, hardly knowing that he did so. However much he thought about it, because he had his work, his friends, and much else besides, there was space in his life it couldn't occupy. Between these hours was when he permitted himself to worry, and inside of them he turned away from any thoughts that might lead him in that direction. If his thoughts should stray towards what was bothering him, the problem would seem easier because he looked past his worries at the problem itself. He didn't realize that, and thought it seemed easier because he wasn't looking at it properly, meaning not looking at it hard enough, as he did when he had time for it, with eyes so alert for concerns that they invented them for fear of missing one. Thinking of a new plan, he fell silent and breathed quietly, not wanting to disturb what was taking shape in his mind. It was hard to say when he would hit upon the solution. He had felt this way many times before, but this time it was a plan that withstood his scrutiny. He wasn't yet so sure of it that he wanted to tell his friends about it and hear what they had to say, or see if they could find a flaw that he'd overlooked. Rather than wait, he went at it before his doubts became any clearer. Hoping to inform himself and so better come to a decision, he drove to each workplace to simulate his commute. He went when he could, late in the afternoon, and tried to see what kind of traffic he would have to contend with, coming home from work and early in the morning going to it. He told his friends these strategies when discussing his options, trying thereby to survey the facts of the situation and get at the essentials. "Couldn't you have looked it up instead?" his friend asked, tentatively, unsure even as he said it whether he wanted to hear the explanation. "No," he said, "I did it while running some errands. I wouldn't go all that way just for that." That was, he later admitted to himself, an evasive answer. Of course he could have looked it up, but he had wanted to go there and see it for himself, as if that would make his decision any easier. His inspections of the routes had happened weeks apart, each, he said, as it had occurred to him that he was in the area and may as well take another way home. That was another half-truth. He had been on errands for one of the routes, whichever he had driven first. Weeks later he had been coming home from work, and remembering how he had taken the first of his routes, had then decided to take the second. He remembered how cloudy it had been. The sun couldn't be seen except indirectly when it shone and brightened the clouds it stood behind. He was glad that the sun was there. It meant it was less likely to rain, or it seemed that way, because the clouds were no longer so dark. His routes were rarely monotonous, including those he traveled often. These two new routes led along and were themselves places he had known about, and had even seen a little of when going somewhere else. But only now did he drive along them. There was much that was new to him, and much that he missed. Driving along the routes that were familiar to him, such as his commute, he passed lightly over what he knew already, the shops and the people standing outside them. If luck should have it, he might see something that he hadn't noticed before. Brought to a standstill by traffic, he had all the time he could have wanted to look. One of the offers was from a business in the city he lived in. To get there, he took a left at the intersection where going right, as habit and instinct initially led him to do, took him to where he worked now. Then he drove 10 minutes in the opposite of his usual direction, and was astounded at what a difference that made, and at how much of the city he had yet to know. The route to the business that had made the second offer led over a bridge above a lake. He had seen it only once before, while driving by the outskirts of the city. He had been driving around, not quite sure where he was, but not lost either. He had returned the first time in the same meandering way he'd come, and found it was easier to go out with no direction in mind than to find his way back home. Guided by his dim memory of how he got there, and not wanting to use his GPS, he found his way over there again. He went slow when he wasn't sure where to go, picking up speed when he was. He kept a lookout for anything that struck him as familiar. He spent more time looking around once he got there than was needed, and remembered the place and the way there better than before. From that day on, he felt more aware of his options and of how easy it would be to realize them. Knowing the way there brought those jobs to mind when he was at that intersection or near the outskirts. That was another time when his thoughts would turn towards his problems and find them smaller and simpler than expected, and then he would look back on that and call it an error of judgment. Driving home from his excursion in the outskirts, he felt happy and called his friends. Some of them picked up. He had to shout so that his words came through and weren't swallowed up by the sound of the engine. Driving was as good as walking for stimulating his thoughts, and his shouting was practical when he drove. He said nothing about his excursion, saving that for later. However much it might consume him, he always said less of it than he thought. He didn't want to be difficult to talk to. He said a little about himself, and then listened to his friends talk about themselves, and then listened to his friends talk about their lives. He was quiet when there was traffic and things were difficult, though he rapped a hand on the steering wheel in frustration and disbelief, and he continued to talk when things got better. It was the same when anything got to be too much for him. He told his friends the reason for his silence so as not to unnerve them by dropping out suddenly, or letting them think he had called them just to ignore them. "Wait a minute," he said. They heard him gunning the engine and overtaking another car, and waited for him to carry on talking. He did, and found something more to talk about, turning his thoughts away from what was on his mind. He had kept it to himself, and nothing had come of that. Now, days later, he told his friend about what he had done. Again his friend told him not to make so much out of it. Let the offers come in however they came, and see what happens. He shouldn't waste his time on that. When he did come to a decision, he would give his friends the credit and thank them. Though he had argued with himself about it, and had convinced himself intellectually, it was still his nature to feel there was something transactional about his relationships. He gave his friends the credit for his improvement in outlook, thanked them and swore he would repay them, then forgot about it when the feeling was gone. It was that feeling of gratitude that rose and swelled within him. He wanted to promise his friend anything for his help, but he said nothing. He waited 5 seconds, 10, his friend hearing only the noise of the seabirds and his sighing that came in snorts through his nose. Finally, he spoke. It wasn't something he could do anything about. "You're right," he said. "I'll wait and see how it goes. There's no point acting like this." "No," his friend agreed. "And how are you otherwise?" his friend asked him, wanting to put this behind them. "Better now," he said. "The weather's not that good. Too hot. Either it stays hot or it rains." They found other things to talk about, something between these banalities and the decision he had given so much weight. As they talked, he grew surer of what his friend suggested. He had gotten this advice of what his friend had suggested. He had gotten this advice before, but something now made him more receptive to it. He guessed it was his failure to come to a different decision, one of his own making. It became something he would do, what he knew had to be done to escape his present confusion. He repeated that in his mind, saying it to himself again and again, as if to remember it, and moreover to make himself understand that he could stop worrying. The plan settled down deep inside of him and was stronger, more solid than before, not something he could doubt or wanted to. That was A Neutral Expression, written and read by Philip Ballerscheff. Once again, if you'd like to read along to these stories, you can find a link to my blog in the description of this video. And as always, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you, and until next time.